now, aren't we? This and the last episode both haven't really been focusing that much on Sheridan, but I just want to comment once again how amusing it is to me, his continued naivete. He actually has this line, "Why don't they surrender?" And a second line, "They can't want to die, not for Clark." Assuming that's the only possible reason they might be doing this. Also keeping in mind that he encountered someone who was willing to die for Clark in just the previous episode, so... It reminds me of a character in another bit of fiction, more recent than Babylon 5. Garrosh Hellscream. I know, a lot of you are going to be upset at me for bringing this up, but I bring it up because what Garrosh did when he holed up for the siege of Orgrimmar is very similar to what's happening here with the Clark administration. Those who are loyal are probably loyal because they're evil, or they're afraid. And that leads to a situation where there's no retreat allowed and no surrender accepted, right? I mean, some will. Obviously, some will turn and be like, "Oh, I'm not doing with this." But over in Warcraft, a huge body of the Orcish population was wiped out because Garrosh would not allow them to submit or surrender. And if they fled, if they tried to retreat from the battlefield, they were killed by their own troops. There were enough people loyal to the regime in order to ensure that the rest remained loyal to the regime. And as a consequence, well, everything was worse for everyone, basically. And I feel in many ways that's what's happening here with the Clark regime. The idea that, you know, captains or soldiers might be like, "Look, no, if I go back, Clark's going to kill me. If I submit and you lose, Clark's going to kill me. If you win, you might kill me anyways for war crimes and all the other horrible stuff that might come from that." No, this is a no-win scenario. I've got to keep fighting the fight, right? It's not hard to understand that mentality, even though it is also immensely frustrating because of how much of a problem that's causing. Pretty much everything else... Oh, sorry, actually, one other thing. I was going to say, pretty much everything else has to do with Garibaldi and his side of the plot, but before we go further, there's an interesting scene where they're talking to the captain of the Agamemnon. I actually don't remember his name. And he's like, "Hey, what's up? Hey, how's it going? Yeah, so what's going on?" Yeah. The reason he gives for why they knew to trust Sheridan was because they were hearing propaganda that was in direct contrast to each other, right? The two sides of the truth were completely contrasting each other. So one way or another, one group is lying, okay? Logically speaking, we can determine that. Then one of those groups starts giving illegal orders to start attacking civilians. Honestly, I feel like that was one of the biggest mistakes the Clark regime ever made. They were well on their way to drag this out into a long, brutal fight, or worse, actually somehow win this, except they started firing on civilian targets and really clamping down. Honestly, I kind of found myself wondering if that was almost necessary from a writer's perspective, either to move the story on, again, maybe part of the Season 5 thing, or maybe just because of good storytelling, I don't know, or because, let's be honest with ourselves, the Clark administration is not that smart. Almost everything they do is pretty much straight out of the textbook, and we'll see a lot of that, I think, next episode. Pretty sure next episode is when we're going to get into that. So just about everything they've done is the kind of thing that you could walk up and be like, "Okay, hang on. Let me read a book about, you know, evil regimes. Okay, do this, do this, do this. Okay, and they're just going down the checklist. I'm not sure what I think of that, to be completely honest with you. If I was to say anything, and I know from many, many interviews from JMS that this was done deliberately, its entire point, from a writer's perspective, is to emphasize how you don't have to be amazingly smart or amazingly powerful. You don't have to be an Emperor Palpatine. You don't have to be, you know, some incredible manipulative guy from some other bit of fiction. No, you just need to have a regime and fear in order to make this kind of thing work and happen, as has happened in real-life history more often than we'd care to think about. And I think that's the point. I don't think the Clark regime was ever supposed to be a brilliant, amazing, yes, I will do these 15 things and win. No, they've been bumbling around like idiots the entire time, and that's the point. So I don't think that's bad writing. Really, based on the evidence. I do think that is very deliberate. Which is funny, because that brings us back to Garrosh, who was an idiot, written deliberately to be an idiot. But I digress. And of course, that's a summarization, and therefore doesn't actually get across the true nuance of the character. Moving on, Garibaldi, right? One thing that's interesting, I've been noticing. I didn't really bring it up, but I've been noticing that Garibaldi has been really fixated on learning the truth. Now that's not super out of character, and so it hasn't really been comment-worthy until I start yawning, until this episode. But in this episode, he starts going way out of his way to learn the truth. Like it becomes a thing for him. And it gets to the point where it gets suspicious. At least for us, the viewers, because we, of course, have... we know Garibaldi as a character. We've had 4 years to get used to him. This is the last time I'm going to bring it up because it's finally over. This, more than anything, is why I feel that they never should have mentioned the mind control thing. I know that they were doing foreshadowing. I know they were trying to get across the point. But imagine the potential impact of the scene where if Garibaldi sits down, like, cut out the tooth scene. Just have him sitting there in the pod, stony-faced, tells Lise to get out and go home. And then Bester steps in. Oh, wouldn't that have blown everyone away? If we had had nothing. If this whole time we're just like, maybe something's up with Garibaldi, but maybe not, and, well, now the shadows are gone, so it's not them. What the heck's going on? And then he leaves, and all this stuff. And then finally the conclusion moment as Bester sits down there and explains everything. That would have had so much more impact. Now, it's still a good scene. Which brings me to a point. I actually have very few notes on this episode, but I love it. Oh, this is one of my favorite episodes. I could just gush about this episode. I have one complaint about it, which we're not at yet. Just absolutely love this episode. But anyways, so you notice as we're going through the episode that Garibaldi is liking what he's having to do less and less. And it's like he's just putting up with it. It's like, oh, God, I need to just deal with this in order to get to the point I want to get to. Now, of course, the point he wants to get to is learn the secret plot against Telepaths. Okay, yeah, sure. But you notice the thematic significance? Excuse me, that's the wrong word. The thematic parallel. In Garibaldi, we see someone who is doing something he, even in his programmed state, clearly does not want to do, and clearly finds distasteful. He has that wonderful line of 30 pieces of silver. That was a nice touch. And this whole time he's just like, all right, enough. And when it gets to the point, he's like, you need to tell me the truth. This is getting ridiculous. I've just sold up my best friend. Come on, tell me the truth. Tell me the truth. And then he finally gets the truth. But he's doing all this crap that he doesn't want to, and he feels like he needs to. He even had that speech last episode about that. The parallel is to Sheridan, actually. Sheridan, this entire time, through this whole Civil War, is doing something he hates. We even see that in this episode, and we saw it in last episode. I'm going to point back to that one scene. Get to the life pods. Get to the life pods. It is tearing him up doing this. Watching his own people kill his own people is just, why? What are you doing? Stop! Yet he has to do it. He has to militarily stand up against the Clark regime. And, to be blunt, I agree with him. He does have to do this. So Sheridan, ironically enough, does trust Garibaldi when stuff gets real. You notice that? It's interesting because it reminds me of Witcher 3. And a lot of other fiction, actually. There's that type of character who you may or may not like, or may or may not find competent, or may or may not care for. There's all sorts of reasons why they might be questionable. But when everything is serious, when things get real, when the chips are down, the cards are on the table, you can rely on them. And Sheridan treats Garibaldi like that. I kind of like that. I've heard some people comment that Sheridan walked into this trap too blindly. I don't actually agree with that. I think Sheridan walked into this trap because he trusted Garibaldi when the chips were down. He was like, yes, this is real. I gotta trust him. It's not until they hear the confirmation about, oh my God, he betrayed us and all that fun stuff, that it then reaches the point where they think that he did it. And Ivanova's, wow, I want him shot on sight. It is perhaps an amazing irony. Not irony, that's the wrong word. It's horrible that Garibaldi immediately tries to call B5 to deal with things or fix things or tell them what's going on. And Bester was right. They're not even picking up. They don't even pick up the call. He can't even leave them a message. And if he shows up, they'll shoot him. Where's he going to turn to now? I'll get more to that in a moment, though. So let's rewind scene. So then there's the tranquility scene. This is the only scene I didn't care for in the movie. Or not the game, the episode. It's the only scene I didn't really care for. First of all, I thought the usage of the music was a little bit too much. Come on. And I thought it dragged on just a little bit too long. But I will say this for it. While the first half just made me kind of go, ugh, I know this is going to sound really horrible, but by the time they started viciously beating Sheridan as he's lying on the floor helpless, that's about when it started being a good scene for me. I know that sounds terrible, but think about it. First of all, JMS has always very strongly believed that if you're going to use personal violence, you need to do it with impact. You need to do it sparingly, and you need to make sure that it is not glorified. This is ugly. And they do a really good job in this episode of demonstrating how ugly violence really is. About what it feels like to have the crap kicked out of you. There's a scene later which is just horrible. He is being, unlike his victim, Sheridan is receiving good, blah, 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 blah. And then it cuts to him literally just being beaten up. They haven't even asked him any questions. They're just beating on him. Because Clark administration. And of course, Garibaldi's face the whole time is just... Edgars insists, kind of passively, that the resistance is screwed without Sheridan. Now, I find that funny for two reasons. The first reason is that his whole point, his entire reason behind getting Sheridan captured, was because he wanted this to go down so that Clark would lower his guard and they could implement their final solution to the telepath problem. I'll get to that in a moment. I don't think Edgars has recognition of reality. I know that sounds like a weird statement, but let me explain what I mean by that. Too many people get really, really good at, really, really used to, or really, really smart with regards to fake things, like politics. Now, I know that sounds weird, but here's what I mean. Politics are fake, okay? All politics are fake. They're not really happening. It's the interactions between people. Thoughts, ideas, and concepts are not real, okay? I'm defining my terms here so you understand where I'm going with this. I mean, yes, they can have a real impact. Yes, they matter. But this is real. This is physical. This is impacting. This is something that cannot in any way, not counting. Okay, we're getting way off topic here. The point being, that's fake, and the more physical is real. To give you an idea what I mean by this, there has been, this is true in fiction and in real life, there have been cases of people who are so politically connected and so diplomatically set up or so economically backed that they felt they were untouchable. And then someone walked up with a gun and shot them. Or a sword. Or an army. Those things are real. And, unfortunately or not, reality does tend to trump politics, fake, economics, whatever. Reality tends to trump the fake. The softer side of life. I mention this because Edgars, by his own admission, is someone who is part of a secret cabal of mega corporations who have run Earth Gov for God knows how many years, right? They're all fake. They have a massive impact on everything. Again, just like politics do. But if you show up with an army who is loyal to you, they're screwed. You understand where I'm going with this? And too often, characters like that tend to sort of get into the mentality that real things, violence or force of arms or force of people or decisions or whatever, can't actually affect the fake. I'm saying all of this in a really kind of roundabout way, forgive me, because we're getting into some serious metaphysics, and I'm trying really hard not to get into the whole definitions of truth, maybe this doesn't actually exist, implications of perception. Let's just not even get into that. Point being, people like Edgars tend to look at the situation and say, well, all I need to do is get rid of the figurehead. The rest of it won't know what to do, at least for a while. He has no idea how a military operates. More to the point, he has no idea how an insurrection operates. And he definitely does not understand the concept of what the resistance and the insurrection are fighting for. Because motivation is something that too often people like him completely throw out the window when it comes to their equations. The insurrection against the Clark regime is not going to be like, oh God, we lost Sheridan, what do we do? No. They're going to drive straight for Earth and deal with this problem. And I don't feel like this is a spoiler because Ivanova flat out says this in the episode. That's exactly what they're going to friggin' do. If I'm not mistaken, they reach Earth in 2 episodes of their campaign from now. I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure the exact timing. But my point is, they don't slow down. They don't stall. They don't... what do they do? They go faster! Sheridan has just become a martyr, Edgars. Do you not know how this works? There's a nice little scene where Lita talks about the Bloodhound Pack and the consequences of that. It's a fascinating scene because it's not really about the Resistance or the Insurrection or Clark or anything like that. It's all about the massive cultural and societal gap that exists between telepaths, teeps, and mundanes, normies. It's interesting to me because that hasn't really been a lot of focus, with one exception prior to this that I can think of. Please feel free to mention one if I've forgotten one, not counting books and whatnot, obviously. The previous mention where this really came up was when Bester flat out said, no, we're the superior race, we are the future, this is my motivation for helping you, it's because blah, blah, blah. He just laid it all out on the table. And I kind of liked that, actually. It was rather honest. Lita flat out says there's going to be a telepathic war, but the truth is we've already known this. I mean, this is an inevitable thing. I would be astonished if there wasn't an actual war between the telepaths and the mundanes. And Edgars, of course, agrees with this too. The previous episode made this clear. This episode makes that adamantly clear. What's really, really messed up, there's a great scene. I've talked before about why I like Edgars as a villain. Because he is simultaneously for the heroes, like he agrees with the same ends that the heroes do, right? But he's also against them. But mostly he just cares about himself and his own situation, the status quo thing. And yet he is not a cruel man. He is not an overtly malevolent man. I talked about that extensively last time. You know, the whole distance thing, right? It's funny because that distance thing is how he uses it as a shield. The actor does a great job with the performance. He's talking about how we have to do this for the telepaths, and we need to set this up, and we need to set up a slave race. They have the advantages. We need to counteract those advantages. He's just talking through the whole thing to Garibaldi, laying out the whole plan, right? Watch that scene again sometime, or just if you have a good enough memory or have watched it recently, think about it really quick. Because what's happening is he's trying to convince himself. And he builds steam as he's doing it. Like he slowly gets more energy and more conviction in his tone and in his thing. This is Mike Vihar again, by the way, as the director. Great job, as usual. So he builds more steam, and he gets to the point where he is absolutely certain of it, because all he's doing is distancing himself from it. Let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. One of the things we as humans do is we put labels on people specifically to distance them. You know, here's Bob, right? I know that doesn't help because Bob... I've known a Bob. I'll use a real-life Bob that I've actually... So here's Bob, and he's a decent guy. He's got some eccentricities, but, you know, he really likes this, and he dislikes this. I don't actually want to tell you about Bob. It just occurred to me. There's layers, there's depths. He's a person, right? Well, what if I call Bob a geek? What if I call Bob a loser? What if I call Bob, you know, an American? I could use other words, but I don't like using those words. But just insert your favorite cuss word here, too, because that applies as well. What you're doing when you're doing that, really, is you're putting a label on them and pushing them away. Because now you're not looking at Bob, you're looking at a label, right? And so as Edgars is going through this whole speech, he is putting this label on all these telepaths so that they're just the telepath until finally it reaches this critical moment where he's like, yes, and then we'll at long last have our solution for the telepath problem. The way he stumbles over that line is perfect. Because in that moment, after he's done all this work mentally to distance himself from the people he is actively trying to kill or enslave, in that moment he realizes what he's saying. And it's all of a sudden it's right up and personal again. Think about that. I love that nuance. I love that shading that adds to him as a character. So, we of course learn why it is that Garibaldi has been pushing all this time, and we learn, why. I mentioned previously the question, whoever's controlling Garibaldi, why go through all this effort? What's he after? The irony is, of course, I knew this then, but now I can just tell you flat out, the whole point was not so much, we need you to do this exact specific thing, so much as, find out if there's any anti-telepath conspiracies. Bester himself, when he finds out about the truth of it, is like, whoa! Oh, also, sorry, anti-shadow, too. He wants to make sure, excuse me, he wants to find out if there's any shadow machinations, because I'm with Bester. The odds that the shadows engineered this whole thing is like 99%. It's very likely. So, just be on the lookout for conspiracies. You're Garibaldi, you're good at that. I also, speaking of gray villains, love how Bester is presented here. He is not a good guy. But he did not do this out of, malevolence. He did not do this out of cruelty or capriciousness. He did this because he wanted this to be accomplished, and he had a tool that was perfect for doing it, Garibaldi. And thanks to the whole shadow thing, yeah, you. And then Harlan Ellison mentally reprogrammed Garibaldi. Some of you will get that. I love it. I want you to keep something in the back of your mind. This will not come up for several episodes. Bester flat out says, my telepath. Someone was threatening my telepaths. It's an interesting emphasis. I really want you to just keep that in the back of your mind for later, okay? We're not done with Bester. So Bester, of course, is a fascinating example of a villain, because he, like Edgar's, is either for or against the protagonist's goals for basically his own reasons. Unlike, okay, it is debatable if Edgar's is evil. That's debatable. Most people would not debate if Bester is evil. And there's some reasons for that, which we haven't actually really gotten into yet because it hasn't really come up yet. What I find most interesting, though, is that the debate exists at all. Those are the kind of villains I tend to really like. I mean, that's not universally true. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Kefka, for God's sakes, and yeah. But if you have a villain where you have to really debate their morality and their, I suppose, their mentality, their perspective, I love that. I love having that kind of shading to a character, and Bester is that in shades. And of course, Walter Koenig absolutely nails it, as he always does. But here's the real question that I have for you. Is Bester cruel? Because whether he's evil or not is heavily debatable. But is he a cruel individual? Now, let's define cruelty really quick. I want to hurt you because it will hurt you. Or, I want to hurt you because it will amuse me. That's pretty much cruelty in a nutshell right there. No reason for it. No purpose. No grand scheme. No, I had to do this. Nothing. It's just screw you because it brings me enjoyment. Would you think Bester is defined as cruel? I don't. It could be strongly argued that he is. I'll admit that freely. Because he does probably what in that moment is the worst thing that could be done to Garibaldi. Tells him the whole truth, and then lets him go. Congratulations, you have burned all your bridges, and now you know you've been played like a fiddle for, like a year at this point, basically. And you have no life and no nothing. Have fun, buddy. I find it interesting, though, because in my opinion, that's not actually why Bester did that. I think Bester did it for two reasons, why he let him go, so to speak. The first and most important reason, because Bester is a pragmatist, is because Garibaldi might be useful in the future. The second reason, though, I think I think Bester does have a concept of compassion. I don't think he's incapable of it. And I think he was pretty much willing to let Garibaldi go for hope, is the only word I can give to that. The idea that maybe you might have some kind of life after what you've done. Maybe. I'm giving you the chance. Because that's the hard truth of it, isn't? While Garibaldi is currently in a worse-than-death scenario, will that scenario maintain? Will it improve? Will it get worse? That's the hope clause right there. he has given him the possibility of that hope. If he just left him there, no hope. If he shot him, no hope. But he has left him that tiny little fragment of, go ahead. I mean, it's not like, in addition to this, by the way, if I might be so bold, it's not like Garibaldi's a threat to Bester. What the hell is he going to do about it? As I mentioned earlier, Ivanova literally isn't taking his calls. So, why not? Because I don't think Bester is cruel. I think he is pragmatic, and I think he is evil. But there are many shades to what those words mean. And I love that about this show. You know another thing I love about this show? Things can always get worse. Oh, I think I know what episode's next. And it's going to be hard to sit through it if I'm being honest. Oh, so I'll see you next time, guys.